Hey there, welcome to the DFS Build NFL edition. I'm Kevin Roberts, getting ready to go over the two-game Saturday slate. Super Wildcard Weekend is here. It should be a lot of fun. You can look at the total main slate, which I will go over later. I'm going to wait till I get updated projections and ownership for the main slate, just because we're talking about a lot of different games and just want a clearer picture of what is going on before I go over that. This is the two-game slate, so obviously it is the first set of games that happen before anything else goes down. So I think people will be a little bit interested in attacking it. So I'm going to do a breakdown now with the tentative projections that are available over at Roto Grinders currently. I wouldn't trust the projections fully or the ownership yet, but I will still use them as guiding points to a degree. If anything I do here helps you out, hit that like button. Also consider subscribing to the channel. Both those things help you out quite a bit. We also have our Discord linked in our profile on YouTube here. But all that stuff helps grow the community. Also helps us out. Helps us out a lot. Lets YouTube know that we're doing something right. Lets us know that we're doing something right. So don't miss out on community interaction, updated core plays, and extra advice by joining the Discord and subscribing to the channel right now. All right, let's get into it. Obviously, a two-game slate is a bit of a crapshoot. If you don't get a perfect lineup, you might have a bit of difficulty even cashing, let alone scoring a takedown. So you kind of have to hit it perfectly. So when it comes to smaller slates, this is basically like showdown territory. I want to either just do one lineup I really like in a single entry, still want to use a lineup optimizer if you can, to get something close to the optimal, and then make a few adjustments based off of your own preferences, perhaps even your own projections, and then maybe make yourself different enough to give yourself a chance to go up over the other optimal lineups out there. Or you just play a lot of lineups. You just kind of play with where the ownership is at. And right now you can see like the ownership is not even a thing right now. So just ignore that. I'll refresh it just in case it might update, because there was ownership earlier. So that's why I was ready to dive on here with some ownership, but that's not really the case. That said, you can still you should definitely consider attacking a smaller slate with many lineups. So if you're going to go cheap, and not spend a lot of money, not a major investment, you could just max like a 10 cent or a quarter or a dollar one where there's 20 entries per person. So then you're giving yourself several outs, different possibilities, and you're not going up against like 150 entries or something. All right, let's go position by position. Starting at quarterback, Lamar Jackson comes in with the best projection at 23 fantasy points. I think these projections will update again, and we'll get a better idea of where everybody stands. But honestly, this all sounds just about right. Lamar has been a beast all year. Here, let me pull up the two-game slate here. He's averaging 26 fantasy points per game of the year, probably going to be the MVP. The only downside with Lamar Jackson is he's going to be the highest owned quarterback on the slate, rightfully so, because he's a monster. I mean, he's coming off a 22-point fantasy game. He's had 21-plus fantasy points in each of his last 5 games. Exhibited his ceiling a few weeks ago against the Giants with 37 fantasy points. That was tied for his best game of the year. So massive ceiling, really nice floor. Obviously, he's got the rushing ability. He's been very, very good as a passer. If you haven't been keeping track of it, he's been shockingly good as a passer. The best passing numbers he's ever put up, over 4,000 passing yards and 41 touchdowns against just 4 interceptions. So this version of Lamar Jackson is not just a rusher. So don't fall into that narrative at all if you have not been keeping tabs. So the only issue here is he's going to be owned, and he's facing the Steelers, who didn't really exactly lock him up in the last game. He still had 28.4 fantasy points. But the game before that, he only had 15. So it's unclear exactly what version of Lamar Jackson is going to show up come playoff time, because obviously historically he and the Ravens are not super, super reliable come playoff time. For whatever reason, they just hit a wall. I think past iterations of Lamar and the Ravens, I think it's been a lot to do with, inexperience, bad matchups, and a lack of like 100% health. Like Lamar has not been super healthy in a lot of his playoff runs. This year, that's not the case. He's faced the Steelers twice, so there's obviously that. They are familiar with him. So I'm a little bit wary of trusting in Lamar fully. So I don't mind going a little bit underweight on him, but 100% Lamar Jackson is the best quarterback play on the slate. If I'm doing 150 lineups, I'm probably going to get to him like 70%. I mean, that feels a little bit high, but I think that's probably what I'm going to do. I do want a sprinkling of the other options just because I mean, I'm going to be overweight is basically what I'm getting at. I'm going to be overweight on Lamar, but I do see the logic in being underweight. Playoff games tend to be more of defensive battles. This is a rivalry game. The Steelers defense is fully capable of being a productive unit, even against one of the best offenses in football. But I'm just going to bet on Lamar Jackson here. I think he's got the best projection. He's honestly coming in at a discount considering who he's been and who he can be. And he has had high level success in this exact matchup already this year. So I'm not that worried about it. I think he is the play at quarterback. Elsewhere, you are saving a ton of cash at quarterback. So if you do want to go underweight on Lamar, I do think there is some logic to that. And, you can save a ton of money with these other guys. And then if Lamar has just an okay game, like anywhere between 18 and 25 fantasy points, and doesn't completely nuke the slate, then you're going to gain a massive edge on the field. So no doubt about it. I still think Lamar is the way to go here because these other guys just don't have the same ceiling, and they do have possibly very low floors. I mean, Dusty Russell Wilson is not a guy that I feel super good about. 11 fantasy points in like a big game in a soft matchup against the Bengals last week. That's not great. He has a low floor, 9 fantasy points against the Eagles 4 weeks ago. Against this very Ravens defense, which has been a pass funnel unit on the year, he had 7 fantasy points the first time he met him, and then 17 3 weeks ago the second time he met him. In theory, the Ravens have been a pass funnel defense, and Russell Wilson at 5.3K should have, there's a path to him producing and getting it done, but it's on the road. The Ravens are collectively very good. I expect the Steelers to be playing from behind. So the only thing that makes me like Russell Wilson, well, the only things I should say, are he's cheap and he should be throwing a lot in this game. So there is a path for him to get there. If you don't think Lamar is going to hit, you certainly can drop all the way down and use Wilson, who has the 3rd best projection and is the cheapest quarterback on the entire slate. But he's the last quarterback that I actually want. I think Justin Herbert at $700 more is a little bit more interesting. The Houston Texans are not like the cakewalk matchup everybody wants them to be necessarily. Let's see. Yeah, in the last 4 weeks, they're still, they're just middle of the pack against quarterbacks, but it's not like it's the tastiest matchup in the world. But Herbert does come in with the 2nd best projection. He's not that much more than Russell Wilson or CJ Stroud, and he has been pretty productive on the year. 17 fantasy points per game. That makes him the 2nd most reliable option at the quarterback position. It's coming off a huge game against the Raiders last week, 31 fantasy points. He's been red hot with 23 plus fantasy points in 3 straight games. So, I mean, the Chargers of old are very difficult to trust. There's so many games where the Chargers have gone into the playoffs and just completely imploded. But this is the Jim Harbaugh Chargers. Maybe, just maybe, it's different now. And the Houston matchup is good enough. And Justin Herbert does offer that dual threat upside too. Not quite as, flashy as Lamar, but he does have the ability to impact the game with his legs. And he's at enough of a discount to where you're getting such nice savings that Herbert is my 2nd favorite quarterback on the slate, as he probably should be. So I do like him. I'm going to get a little bit of exposure to him for sure. Just, again, I'm still going very hard at Lamar here just because he's by far the best play at the position. CJ Stroud, I will mention at 5.5K. I think I do prefer him over Russell Wilson. He has the worst projection right now of the slate, which I don't necessarily agree with, because if we get into a situation where, Russell Wilson and CJ Stroud are both playing from behind and throwing the ball a ton, I trust CJ Stroud a little bit more. I think he offers a little bit more upside. He hasn't been good. I will say that, but he did look fine in the limited duty he had in week 18, 6 for 6, 50 yards and a touchdown. He has Nico Collins there. He does not have his full arsenal of weapons. Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell both out for the season, but he feels cheap, feels a little bit too cheap at home against the Chargers, who, by the way, the Chargers on the year have been a good scoring defense. But I think they've been like bottom 20 over the last 4 weeks. Yeah. So they've been a bit softer against quarterbacks, 9 touchdowns allowed over the last 4 games. So I don't think it's as bad as the situation Russell Wilson is in. So I'm not blown away by Wilson or Stroud. The only real appeal is that they probably will be throwing the ball a lot while they play from behind, and they're cheap. So you can do that. And if you're not going to play Lamar in those lineups, you could certainly go that route. I just think it's probably, for me, between Lamar and Herbert with a very strong lean on Lamar. I think we could just get different in other spots and not get super cute here. Just Lamar with the rushing ability, with the way he's been throwing the ball, with all the weapons he has. I just think he's the play. And if you don't want to go Lamar, I think Herbert is probably the right way to go. I'm going to double stack those Ravens guys, Henry too. Just there's nobody else really that feels amazing at running back. There's also Joe Mixon there, so don't pay attention to the projections right here. They're just not updated. Joe Mixon, this is probably reflective of last week where Dameon Pierce had like 170 rushing yards. Dameon Pierce at 4.7K, because he was so good last week, I wouldn't be like completely shocked if he's worked into the offense a little bit more. But traditionally, Houston is running with their main guy most of the time. Mixon should eat up most of the snaps. And we know how productive Mixon has been all year. 18.7 fantasy points per game, second among running backs in this slate, and he's $1,000 cheaper than Henry. I don't really want to replace Henry with him. I think Henry is the call, but I don't mind pairing them if I have the funds to get there. I don't think that's something I'm going to do. I think I'm going to definitely look to save at RB2, but if you want to pair Henry with Joe Mixon, I don't mind it. And if you're picking between the two, I think Henry is the call. Henry has been awesome on the year, 21 fantasy points per game on the year, 23 plus fantasy points over his last 3 straight games. He has been a monster. Against the Steelers, 23 fantasy points the last time he faced them. The game before that, he did get shut down a little bit, was only 11 fantasy points. He is touchdown dependent, but he's been running all over the place, 20 plus carries in each of his last 3 games. So now it's playoff time. It's do or die. So the Ravens are going to feed this dude. I just don't see any, unless you like really think the Ravens are just going to lay an egg and get beat by the Steelers here. I just don't see any reason to go away from them. They're the best offense on the table. And all things considered relative to the slate, Henry and Lamar feel kind of discounted. So I like them quite a bit. J.K. Dobbins at 6.2K. I mean, in theory, that's a decent price. And, I think we can certainly go there. I think I would probably prefer to save a little bit more money at RB2. 6.2K is a fair price for what his projection sitting at right now. In the matchup with the Texans, while not amazing, it's not like super scary. So I think Dobbins is fine. He does come in right now with a second best projection. I would imagine that's actually going to be Mixon. If I'm going to pay 6.2K for Dobbins, I might just see if I can find that extra 1,000 to go get Mixon instead. But honestly, my favorite strategy might be to just come in and play Jaylen Warren. Not like I feel amazing about Steelers options in general against the Ravens. I mean, on the road, Ravens are actually really good against the run, by the way, too. So there is that. But Jaylen Warren is just a more explosive option than Najee Harris. He did have success against the Ravens in both games, 14 fantasy points last time, 10 fantasy points the game before that. He's been getting a little bit more work just because Najee is not always effective. But the big play for me here is, number one, he just has a higher ceiling than Najee. Unless Najee just comes in and blows the door off the hinges and gets like 100 yards and 3 touchdowns, which I feel like that is not even remotely within his range of outcomes. I think Warren's the better play. Najee is cheaper by $200, and the projection is pretty tight. But what's the most likely scenario here? The most likely situation is that the Steelers are trailing and Jaylen Warren ends up getting more work because he's a more effective receiver out of the backfield and he's a little bit more dynamic. So I think Jaylen Warren looks like the top RB2 here if you're not paying up. If you want to pay up, just go get Henry and Mixon if you can afford it. If you want to save some cash, RB2 is probably the first place to do it. With Warren. You certainly can play Najee there. We'll see what ownership looks like later because the projection's similar and he is cheaper. And he could always fall into the end zone and get a touchdown, and maybe he just eats up most of the usage and gets catches. It's possible. I just think right now Warren feels like the better play. The only other thing I'd really consider is if what's his name? Gus Edwards. If Gus Edwards is in at 4.3K, he's an interesting leverage off of potentially chalky J.K. Dobbins. The thing is, J.K. Dobbins does not have a massive ceiling. I don't really see him going off here. I think he's just an okay play, and he's priced up to the point where, like, I would much rather save $1,000 and go get Warren or Najee, even though I don't feel good about Najee. or you can leverage that ownership if he does end up being chalky and go play his backup. If healthy, it should be Gus Edwards at 4.3K. But last week, Hassan Haskins kind of crushed. I mean, for his role in the price, 12 carries, 33 yards, and a touchdown, 9 fantasy points. Obviously, it's not like true crushing, but as far as a backup running back goes, he was pretty good. So at his price at 4.4K or Gus Edwards at 4.3K, I think they're interesting leverage on Dobbins. Not like they're safe, but they are interesting leverage, and they should be, whoever is there. If Edwards is in, he should be somewhat involved. And if he's out, Haskins should be somewhat involved. And then also, I'll mention Keaton Mitchell if Justice Hill is out. If Justin Hill is in, he's been missing time with an illness and a concussion. He would be viable at 4.5K too as well. The double stack of the Ravens offense is kind of interesting just because the Ravens are expected to win and lead in this game. So they could late in the game in the second half be running a lot. And obviously they're not going to want to risk Lamar late in the game if they don't have to. And same with Derrick Henry. So entirely plausible to expect the Ravens to dominate here and have Lamar and Henry not really be that necessary and do most of their damage in the first 2 or 3 quarters. And then we see somebody like Keaton Mitchell or Justice Hill end up popping off a little bit. And obviously, if those guys are just rotated in, they are a factor as receivers out of the backfield, and they're pretty explosive too. So I think they are solid punts. Long story short, I'm okay with going Henry Mixon, but for the most part, I want to go Henry and punt RB2. I think Jaylen Warren is the safest / best way to do that, but I do have interest in some of these cheapies if the right situation presents itself. Just keep an eye on the entry stats of those guys. All right, over to wide receiver we go. We cannot trust these projections because they're simply not updated. Nico Collins is going to come in with the best projection among wide receivers. That's just a fact. He is super explosive. He's also pretty expensive. Much like Lamar and Henry, in theory, he's kind of discounted. The only problem is, he is facing a pretty good Chargers defense. That said, the Chargers defense has not been great against fantasy wide receivers. Over the last 4 weeks, they are bottom 10 against the position. So it's not that bad of a matchup, actually. Plus, the Texans should be throwing a lot. I understand reservation on CJ Stroud, but I wouldn't feel like it's a risky thing to go pay up for Nico Collins at all. You can certainly just play him alone and not worry about stacking with Stroud, just because Nico is going to soak up most of the target share there. He's been just okay lately, 14, 8, 13, 17 fantasy points, but he has a massive, massive ceiling. And like I said, I think the matchup is a little bit better than advertised. Now you could play the angle of, he's the only guy they have, so the Chargers just go sell out to lock him up, and then CJ Stroud struggles and Nico just is a bust. If you think that's the case, I think going underweight on Nico is certainly in play. The only problem is there's just not many other options that have a massive ceiling like he does and also are remotely safe. So the other 2 options that stand out are going to be Ladd McConkey and George Pickens. I don't know if this George Pickens projection feels right. I will say he struggled mightily in his last game. Russell Wilson did vouch for him. 1 catch for no yards on 6 targets last week. That was pretty brutal, but we know he has a ceiling. All things considered, given Baltimore's pass funnel defense, the magnitude of the game, the likelihood of playing from behind, he's too cheap. So Pickens looks really good at 6.3K. Ladd McConkey looks really good at 6.8 just because he's super involved. He's had 14-plus fantasy points in each of his last 5 games. He has a ceiling, 29 fantasy points 2 weeks ago. And I think he has like 4 games of 20-plus fantasy points on the year. He's been a sensation as a rookie. He's their number 1 guy, most reliable option. He doesn't have to score a touchdown to get there either. McConkey is a touchdown threat. But he had in week 13, 23 fantasy points with no touchdown. So he's going to get peppered with targets. I don't really think the Texans are going to stop him. So I think when looking at salary, like high-end salary for wide receiver, shockingly so, McConkey is my favorite play at the position. If we get to the point where Nico is just mega owned, like 60% owned, and McConkey's like half of that, if that ends up being the case, I will be all over McConkey and I'll be underweight on Nico. I still love Nico because the ceiling is massive, but he is 7.8K. If you're like me and you're going to go eat the chalk at Lamar and Derrick Henry, you got to get different somewhere, and you do have to sacrifice some high-end salary eventually. So Nico is going to be the first guy that I say, okay, I'm going to go a little bit under Nico and just hope he doesn't blow this slate up. Certainly could, but that is probably where I stand there. So McConkey, Pickens look great. Zay Flowers, if he is in at 6K, is good, but obviously a little risky. He has a knee injury, not even a lock to play in this game. So keep an eye on his status. I think at 6K, the matchup is not amazing. He's not healthy. I don't think I feel like I have to play Zay Flowers here. If Zay Flowers is in, that will be interesting because it could still keep the ownership down on the other Ravens guys. And then Rashad Bateman would be very interesting at 5K flat. If Zay is out, Bateman's going to be super chalky at 5K. Either way, I like Bateman. I think Bateman's a good play. If Zay is in, you can use him. I would just rather get Pickens or McConkey just because the risk with Zay feels a lot higher. Get a quick drink of water for y'all. And hopefully my voice won't be too scratchy. So, okay. So another guy I do not mind, Quentin Johnson obviously would be nice leverage on Ladd McConkey. I don't really think it needs to be a leverage play though, because at 4.8K, he just looks like a value. 13 catches on 14 targets last week, 34 fantasy points. What a ridiculous game to end the year for him. I mean, that is a confidence booster, by the way. He is known for his drops, and he had one target not hauled in for a catch off of 14. Okay, so that's crazy. He looks great. Obviously, he and McConkey are great stacking options with Herbert, but whether you play McConkey or Herbert, QJ looks really good at 4.8K. Even better if Josh Palmer is limited or out. He missed the last game with a foot injury, so keep an eye on that. If Palmer is in at 4.3K, he is a fine value, but I think I prefer QJ here. Just more upside, better touchdown threat, and they got his confidence rolling, and that is dangerous for Houston for sure. More value to be had here for sure. Kelvin Austin III is he was not involved last week at all. But in theory, he is potentially going to be involved on the other side of George Pickens. I think if you're going to pick one Steelers receiver, it's going to be Pickens for me. Austin does provide potential value at 4K flat, but there are other ways to go at value. Obviously, with QJ as one, and then we can look at Houston, which I'll touch on in a second. But Austin looks like solid value. I just think the floor is remarkably low, and he basically needs to hit a long touchdown to pay off. He's just not going to be a high volume target. I would just rather play Pickens there, or I'd go to the tight end, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And obviously, Jaylen Warren is probably going to be an extension of the passing game too. So another reason why Austin, his price looks great, no doubt about it. Just the role is not super, super safe. Like -1 fantasy points last week, 7 fantasy points the week before, 1.4 fantasy points 5 games ago. So just a remarkably low floor. No worries if he's the last guy in, but certainly risky. John Mechie III is another guy to keep an eye on. He has a concussion. Unclear if he's going to play in this game. If he's in at 3.9K, I do not mind him now that Tank Dell is out for the year. He should play a good deal if he's in and be, number one, a really good leverage play on Nico Collins, and just number two, potentially the second or third passing game weapon for CJ Stroud in a game where Houston probably will be playing from behind. Whether he plays or not, you can still consider Robert Woods and Deontay Johnson. Both those guys obviously get a massive boost if Mechie is out. Deontay Johnson had 4 targets and 2 catches last week, and the word on the street is he's going to be involved. I don't see why Houston wouldn't want him involved. He is probably automatically their second best wide receiver. He's a very good slot option, really good PPR guy historically, only 3.5K. So he looks like the best value receiver on this entire slate. The only issue is, obviously, you could always have like these one-hit wonders like Nelson Aguilar, Demario Davis, or Darius Davis, rather. He had, a touchdown in 2 of his last 3 games. You just never know. Tylan Wallace, Xavier Hutchinson, Van Jefferson. You just don't know. Any of these guys could hit. But as far as like any kind of floor and ceiling goes, I think Deontay is the one that stands out. If Mechie is in, I would just look at the ownership. Like if the ownership is still going to flock to Deontay, John Mechie III, if in, would look really interesting as a leverage on the Deontay ownership. Just because Deontay has been a bust ever since being traded away from Pittsburgh. Not really seeing anybody else that I feel like I have to play, but I would just keep an eye on the status of Zay Flowers, Josh Palmer, and John Mechie III, and just see, whoever's out. Then we can look at these other options like DJ Chark possibly, If Palmer's out, he would look a lot more appealing at 3.1K. And then I also mentioned Darius Davis, who's been a little bit more involved lately and can potentially score on special teams. So keep all that in mind when you're looking at the value at wide receiver. I think definitely wide receiver is where I want to soak up my savings as best as I can. All right, over at tight end, Mark Andrews is going to come in with the best projection here for sure, just because he's the most likely bet to score a touchdown. 11 touchdowns on the year. He's had a touchdown in each of his last 6 games. He's been crazy. So he's been very touchdown dependent, though. He has been pretty involved, but in 2 of his last 4 games, he's only had 2 targets. So he's getting a little bit lucky, and we need him to score a touchdown to deliver. The nice thing is the Steelers are a good matchup. On the season, they are bottom 10 against fantasy tight ends, and in the last 4 weeks, they're giving up the second most production to the position. So Andrews looks really good at 4.7K. This is just going to come down to, okay, I have Lamar, I have Henry, maybe I have Nico or Ladd and Pickens. Like, what else is going on in my roster? Like, tight ends, like the last thing I'm going to focus on, just because, Andrews is without a touchdown, possibly a failure here. So I like him because he probably offers the most upside of any of the tight ends, and he's not super expensive at 4.7K, but it just feels like a position where I can sprinkle a lot of different options and maybe not pay up for the chalky guy and get away with it. So if Mark Andrews does not score, if you think that's a possibility, then going other routes here at this position makes a lot of sense. And honestly, we can save money here. You can leverage Andrews' ownership with Isaiah Likely at 3.2K. 5 targets, 3 catches last week. Obviously, he's shown a ceiling. I would imagine, they're just going to split the time out on the field and just split the target share, but Likely is way cheaper, 1.5K cheaper. I think he's a really interesting tournament option, especially if the ownership does flock to Andrews. Pat Freiermuth is really interesting. He's going to come in just under Andrews in terms of projection, but he's been really involved for the Steelers. Too bad he didn't catch a key pass late against the Bengals, because it would have given them a lot more fancy points, and then they probably would have won that game. But he still had 11 targets for 8 catches, 85 yards, and a touchdown, 22 fantasy points last week, and 11 plus fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games. He's pretty involved. Given George Pickens' struggles, given the fact that they do not have a reliable second wide receiver, he basically is their wide receiver too. So I'm interested to see what his ownership is at. He probably will be the second most owned tight end. A little surprised he's not coming in as the second best projecting tight end. I would not be shocked if that ends up changing when things get updated. But, dollar for dollar, Pat Freiermuth is probably my favorite tight end on the board. And hopefully ownership doesn't reflect that, and I can get Pat Freiermuth as an overlooked option. Now, if you want to save at tight end though and completely punt the position and pay up elsewhere, no problem with that. You have Will Dissly, you have Isaiah Likely, and you have Dalton Schultz. All those guys look pretty darn good in that similar price range. Schultz is probably the guy I would look here to, and that might make him chalky. If you go and look at, the projections and the salary and everything, if you go look at a guy and say, oh, that guy's a great play, chances are most everyone's saying that. And that's not a shot on you or myself or anything. It doesn't make you a bad player. In fact, it makes you a good player. It just means that it's such a good play that you might be stupid to not play him, right? Football is a very high variance sport, so even smash plays fail. It is what it is. But Dalton Schultz is a good play. That's just the fact that he stands out makes me think that he's probably going to fail now. But hey, Dalton Schultz is going to be involved because they don't have anybody else. All they have is Deontay Johnson, who they just brought in. Diggs and Dell are dead. He's had 6+ targets in 2 of the last 3 games. So I would expect that role to still be there. The matchup with the Chargers by the numbers is not amazing, but volume is king. So at 3.6K, he's my favorite tight end punt. You can still go Dissly, Likely, maybe even Stone Smart, but I feel like that's getting considerably thin. So for me, it'd be Freiermuth, Andrews, and then Dissly, Schultz if I want to do a punt there. But I do also like Isaiah Likely as a leverage on possibly chalky Andrews. All right, defensively, you honestly could make an argument for everybody here. Obviously, people are playing the Ravens, so could you play a good Steelers defense? They are a good defense. I don't know if they're good enough to really completely silence Baltimore at home. But they're the cheapest defense on the board, a 2.2K. If you want to go get everybody, like every stud and pay up and everything, punting the defense is fine. The funny thing is, though, why go get a 2.2K Steelers defense and then also still pay for Lamar and Henry and, what other Ravens you're going to play? Seems kind of counterintuitive, right? So that can be a winning strategy still if the Steelers get a punt return for a touchdown or a defensive touchdown or a bunch of sacks or whatever the case may be. They are cheap enough for that to still work. It's just not something I think I'm going to do. I could see them giving up like 38 points in a massive blowout and just being a totally epic failure. So all these defenses are going to be in play, even right down to the Steelers. They're just probably my least favorite option. The Chargers could always go full Chargers. So the Texans at 2.7K are also a good value. The Texans have not been good offensively on the year, and the Chargers are one of the better scoring defenses in the league. So the Chargers are in play at 3.2K. But if I can save elsewhere and feel good about it, I think the Ravens at 3.7 just make the most sense. Steelers are probably the worst offense on the board here. The Ravens are at home. They've limited the Steelers in 2 previous meetings, and they have the best projection on the board. So if it's not too cost restrictive and I'm not sacrificing things to go get Baltimore's defense, that is the defense I want. If I'm like only just using a bad defense away from getting the lineup I want, I'm then looking at the Texans and Steelers. I think the Chargers are fine, but I think if you're going to pay 3.2, just go get the Ravens. If you don't want to pay all of that for the Ravens, just go punt with the other two and just, see what works. I would still consider correlating your lineup appropriately. Like, I don't think it's impossible to win that way, but I think if you're going to play the Texans, probably don't stack up a bunch of Chargers, right? So I would just keep that in mind. Maybe even set a rule to keep yourself from doing that. All right, that was a long-winded breakdown for a 2-game slate, but there's a lot to think about even with a 2-game slate. A lot of different possibilities, especially when a lot of the best options, they are just kind of obvious and everybody's going to be playing them. So you have to look at some of the values and some of the game flow possibilities and kind of, check every box, so to speak. I think a lot of the main chalk is going to be good chalk. I don't really see a reality here where Lamar and Henry fail. And it's pretty unlikely that Nico fails. I think of the trio, I think Nico would be the most likely one to fail, though, just because he's the only top shelf option the Texans have. The Chargers defense is pretty good. I can see, them keeping tabs on Nico and making Stroud beat them with somebody else or making the Texans run on them with Mixon or whatever the case. So my personal strategy is going to be to eat the Ravens chalk up top with Lamar and Henry. If I can fit in Nico comfortably, I still don't mind doing that. I think that's just the first spot I would start going down from because I love McConkey. I love Pickens. And if I can get to Mixon, Henry, that's probably where I would go on the slate just because there's a lot of value at wide receiver. And I think sacrificing that possible ceiling of Nico to make a more complete lineup feels like a pretty good way to approach the slate. Okay, hopefully that helps you out. If it does, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you get alerted to more videos just like this. Thanks for watching and good luck.